Okay, so we have an official debate happening. We have Footsoldier, we have Jiva for this debate. Footsoldier's taken the position that Kurt Cobain acted immorally by committing suicide when viewed both from a utilitarian perspective and a deontological perspective. Jiva's taken the opposition. As always, when we base upon who concedes, we don't get a vocal concession from either participant. We'll put it to a voting poll in which you, the audience, can decide on who you think performed better overall in the debate. No time limit, no moderation. You guys can get started.
Thanks. So yeah, the proposition is fairly self-explanatory, I guess. What I would establish is that suicide is always immoral from a deontological perspective, and if we want to reject deontology and we want to have some sort of utilitarian conceptualization of morality, I would argue in the case of Kurt Cobain, it was morally wrong for Kurt Cobain to commit suicide. Not only because it's morally wrong, on my view, for everyone to commit suicide, for anyone to commit suicide. It's against the moral duty that the individual has to themselves and to the um, agency that they have. But also, especially in the case of Kurt Cobain, the amount of suffering and um, worldwide mourning on a scale similar to John Lennon, we could substitute. If John Lennon had committed suicide, then maybe we could have the same conversation about John Lennon or anyone else who was equally famous. But of course, John Lennon was shot, and the tragedy of that was obviously immoral. But the tragedy of Kurt Cobain was not caused by some psychopathic gunman. It was caused by himself. He created the tragedy. He performed this immoral act, which not only was in violation of his moral duty to himself, which we can discuss more after my closing statement, after Jiva has a chance to reply to my opening statement. We can discuss that in more detail. But not only did he have the violation of his moral duty to himself, but also in the utilitarian sense, the amount of grievance, the amount of tragedy that he propagated through the world as a result of the selfish action of taking his life because of the appreciation of his art, but also because of his family and his child. It seems nothing short of immoral to to do that. He wanted to go out with a bang, he said in his suicide note, rather than no, he wanted to burn out rather than fade out, he said in his suicide note. And yeah, he did do that, but I think that was the immoral choice. And I would argue that he would have equally been remembered had he not committed suicide, or he died for some other reason, not to do suicide, or if he died of old age. I don't think he would have been forgotten, because the position that I'm taking to argue against suicide is, of course, from Immanuel Kant, and he also contemplated suicide throughout his life. In fact, the only he wanted nothing more than to kill himself throughout his life. He actually detested life at one point, but the only reason why he didn't commit suicide was because of his moral duty to himself that he was aware of through the categorical imperative that he made famous. And Immanuel Kant certainly didn't fade away. He stands as a beacon of the Enlightenment age philosophical thinking, and one of the, if not arguably the greatest philosophers of all time. And so I don't think suicide is instrumental to cementing your position in the history books at all. And in fact, as demonstrated by Kant, we can cement our position in history books by even growing old and then fading away, where Immanuel Kant famously did mentally fade away towards the end of his life. So for these reasons, and I can elaborate on these reasons, but just in summary, for these reasons, I will be taking the position that it was immoral. for Kurt Cobain to commit suicide. Jiva, would you like to address any of those points?
Yes, I would. Thank you. There are a couple of things on the table, aren't there? So first of all, was Kurt Cobain's suicide immoral? And then the second thing is whether suicide in general is immoral. And if I heard you right, I think you're going to argue for both. And I think we might need to separate them out as well for the purpose of the discussion. So I think it may be easier if I just we start with the general claim that suicide in and of itself is immoral. And also then we probably also need to explore, because the proposition claims that it's immoral from both a deontological perspective as well as a utilitarian perspective. So we may need to separate those out and explore both of those independently as well. And if I'm right, if I can show that even if one of those is not true, the proposition would be defeated. So it has to be both deontology and utilitarianism. But I think it might be a good starting point for us to define suicide. So I just want so that we're on the same page here. It's generally considered quite a self-explanatory definition, but just do you have a specific definition that you're using for suicide?
Well, I think we both understand what we mean by suicide. Whatever definition that you take, unless it's if we discover you're operating with some fringe proprietary definition, we will clarify it later. But I think for now we both understand.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So just intentional. It has to be intentional, right? You have to intend to take your own life through some form of action. Right. Okay. So I'll start by just asking a few questions, if you don't mind. Do you think suicide is always immoral, or can it be amoral in certain circumstances?
No, it's always immoral.
Right. Okay. So you would never deem suicide to be moral then? Absolutely not. Right.
Not under a deontological view. So I'll just address you touched upon this briefly. So the goalposts for the debate proposition are, of course, that I have to demonstrate that it was morally wrong for Kurt Cobain to commit suicide, both in a deontological perspective and in a utilitarian perspective. And if one of those fails, then if I fail to establish one of those, then of course you would win the debate. However, just to clarify the pathways that I'll probably explore, is the suicide being wrong in general is going to apply to deontology, whereas if we're going to have a utilitarian argument, I'm going to apply that to Kurt Cobain specifically, right? Okay. And so I don't feel it's the case that I need to justify how utilitarianism leads to suicide being immoral in general. I only need to justify that specifically to Kurt Cobain in the case of utilitarianism, and with deontology, I'm aiming to justify that globally, which would, of course, entail immorality for Kurt Cobain specifically.
Yes, I think that's a reasonable position, because obviously you can't be expected to justify every suicide in terms of utilitarianism, right? Sometimes some good may come out of a suicide, like Hitler's suicide, for example. So yeah, I will start by just saying it's important to note that not all suicide is due to mental illness, right? People kill themselves for a variety of reasons, such as euthanasia. That's a form of suicide. People kill themselves due to severe physical pain. Religious reasons, activism, protests. People go on hunger strikes. There are spiritual reasons for killing yourself, such as Buddhist monks who self-immolate, wars such as suicide bombers, martyrs. There are also philosophical reasons for suicide, such as pro-mortalism. Historically, you can think of, we've seen suicide rituals in imperial China, ancient Mayan culture, as well as organized religious extremists. You can think of the Japanese warriors who commit seppuku, or used to, for maintaining their honor and integrity. But in all of those examples, you would say they are, from a deontological perspective, immoral.
Right. They are all immoral. And if they believe they are not immoral, they're simply mistaken.
Okay. Now, obviously, the philosophy of suicide has been a subject which has been debated for centuries. And I agree with you. I think my understanding is that Immanuel Kant did claim that it was, from his perspective, an absolute right to not commit suicide. But that has been a contentious point, and many philosophers have disagreed with him, including his contemporaries like Arthur Schopenhauer, who said you can't, who said it isn't immoral because to claim it's immoral would be taking away a person's liberty and their freedom to make decisions about their own life, which he considered was the moral, a moral imperative. So I would like you to maybe just explain why Immanuel Kant says suicide, in your opinion, why he deems suicide to be an absolute immorality, because I don't think he can justify it through the Kantian categorical imperative, can he?
Well, I'll just read you a passage. He says, "A man reduced to despair by a series of misfortunes feels sick of life, but is still so far in possession of his reason that he can ask himself whether taking his own life would not be contrary to his duty to himself. Now he asks whether the maxim of his action could become a universal law of nature. But his maxim is this: from self-love I make as my principle to shorten my life when its continued duration threatens more evil than it promises satisfaction. There only remains the question as to whether this principle of self-love can become a universal law of nature. One sees at once that a contradiction in the system of nature whose law would destroy life by means of the very same feeling that acts as to stimulate the furtherance of life, and hence there could be no existence as a system of nature. Therefore, such a maxim cannot possibly hold as a universal law of nature, and is consequently wholly opposed to the supreme principle of all duty."
Okay, so all duty, I mean, that's very interesting. So all duty. So are you arguing that anybody who does any act which increases their risk of death is acting immorally? So, for example, if you smoke, is that immoral?
Sorry, I was just switching back over to push to talk. Yeah, so the smoking, I would say, if you know that you're harming yourself through smoking and it's likely that you're going to die, but will increase your likelihood through smoking to the point where it's certain or fairly likely that you'll harm or that you will die as a result, then I would say then it would be more of a case of arguing that smoking is suicidal, right? And I would be willing, from my perspective, to grant that suicide is something which is essentially suicidal in nature, right? And but some people, like a Kantian deontologist, might be like, well, no, I disagree that smoking is suicidal, right? So it's going to come down to what you classify as suicidal. However, suicide in itself does not change. The morality of suicide doesn't change. But what we're going to define as being suicidal might be hairy. But in the case of Kurt Cobain, literally blowing your head off with a shotgun is quite obvious suicide.
Well, what I mean by this is yours and Immanuel Kant's justification for why suicide is bad. Is it because it reduces your potential to act morally or dutifully, right? It reduces the length of your life, right? So by that justification, he and you would both have to argue that any act that reduces the length of your life is immoral. So not just smoking. I mean, if you engage in any sort of dangerous sports, like racing car drivers used to have a higher risk of suicide, of death. Sorry, extreme sports, they have a higher risk of death. I suppose if you don't eat very healthy, even if you drink, binge drink, I suppose all of these acts would be deemed immoral under your criteria in that sense, wouldn't they?
Right, well, if you're going to do something which is basically suicidal in nature, then...
Well, not necessarily suicidal, but reducing your life expectancy.
Well, the thing is, if you're going to perform some action which results in you dying, then intentionally, then that is just suicide, right? So I'm saying that suicide is immoral, right? So if you go on some holiday where it's fairly safe, it's extreme sports, but it's fairly safe, you can know that you're probably not going to die. You might like break a bone or something like that in the worst case, but you're probably not going to die. It's fairly safe. It's fairly rare that someone will die. Then of course that's not suicidal. That's just having fun. And there needs to be a balance in life between taking some risks. Otherwise you'd just be sitting in your room, not doing anything and not moving, and then you'll die of lack of exercise and probably malnutrition and whatever else would be a result of that. So it's unavoidable that you have to take risks in life. So you have to take risks. There's no avoiding it. However, if the risks that you take are surely going to lead to your death, that's basically suicide. So if you consider that smoking is so bad for you that it's probably going to result in your death, then that's suicide. And I would agree. Anyone who smokes, I'd say to them, "What, you suicidal or something?" Like, I would say, like, "You want to kill yourself? Like, why are you smoking in 2020? That's ridiculous." If someone says, "Well, I want to jump out of a plane without a parachute and then land on a small landing trampoline thing," I'll be like, "Are you suicidal?"
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
But I just think this justification that he uses, whereby he's saying you're not fulfilling your potential, right, is a little bit sketchy, and it leads to some pretty counterintuitive conclusions. So, for example, would you say sleep is immoral? I mean, most people wouldn't think sleep is immoral, but when you're sleeping, you're not acting morally or dutifully or fulfilling your potential, are you?
Well, it's not just about. I don't know where you get this conceptualization of what Kant's saying as being somehow, oh, you're not fulfilling your greatest potential as a human being or something. That's not what you're saying. That's like more similar to something that Nietzsche would say. And what Kant is saying is the life and the self-love is something which acts to further life, right? And if you perform an action which takes away life, then you're operating under a principle which both serves life and takes away life. So serves to further life and takes away life. So it's a contradiction. It's saying that you're perpetuating life and you're also not perpetuating life simultaneously. So you're seeking to perpetuate and also not to perpetuate life simultaneously. And that's a contradiction. And if there's a contradiction in the principle, it's not possible that that could be any type of law of nature, because natural laws can't be self-contradictory.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder what he would say to, let's say, a suicide bomber in a war, who basically says, right, in order to win this war, I have to, you know, detonate this bomb, but it's going to result in my suicide. But in doing so, I will kill the enemy, and there will be greater, from a utilitarian point of view, there will be a greater good. Will win the war. I mean, so under your view and Immanuel Kant's view, that would be immoral, wouldn't it?
Right, because neither I nor Kant are utilitarians. Right, so
Well, even your justification for the deontological argument is questionable there, isn't it? Because he's saying you have to serve life, but the suicide bomber will argue he is serving life, right? Because if he's fighting or detonating the bomb against an evil dictatorship, let's say against the Nazis, right? Isn't that a good act?
well, look, first and foremost, we have a duty to ourselves, because if we destroy ourselves, we can't possibly have a duty to anything else. We can't. So if we destroy our own duty, then we're destroying the duty that we have to ourselves, first and foremost. So that is a self-contradictory. You can't have a duty to destroy yourself when you have a duty to not destroy yourself, right? We just run into contradictions in a deontological framework. So first and foremost, I have a duty to myself. And now there's going to be a bit of a divergence between myself and classical or Kantian ethics as it was in the time when it was written, because my personal axiom of my system is that like, first and foremost, I'm like the Terminator. I can't self-terminate, right? If I can't act, then there is no morality for me, right? Because I am the center of my universe and you are the center of your universe. And if I'm dead, my universe doesn't exist, and there's no way that I can act, and there's nothing that can be moral. All morality is extinguished the second I die. So by killing myself, I am violating my duty to myself, but then there can be no ultimate benefit from that, because all morality is expunged after that point forwards. So at the point of my action, of the point of my willing to die, I am being immoral. After I die, all morality is expunged. So if I decide to kill myself, which will later save a billion, trillion, quadrillion people. I'm performing an immoral action, which is killing myself. And then all of the things that later occur as a result of my death are completely irrelevant and amoral because they don't exist anymore.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So you wouldn't class soldiers in war just as being immoral, would you? Just because they're obviously running a high risk of dying, because they don't have the intent to die, you would say that's fine. That's an amoral act. Am I correct?
I would say that I personally think that war is irrational in most cases, or at least irrational in the colloquial sense. In the philosophical, maybe not in the philosophical sense. To be more specific, I think that going to war is generally folly, especially in the modern age, unless there is like some absolute unavoidability where it's like fight or perish immediately or something like this. Then you could see, oh, well, you're forced because if I don't fight, then there's some kind of like I am almost committing suicide if I don't fight. And so if I commit suicide, then that is a violation of my duty to myself. But outside that context, I think war is generally folly. So I'm not going to argue for the morality of war because I think it's a load of nonsense anyway, most of the time.
No, that's fair enough. Maybe that's just a rabbit hole we don't want to go down. So, but just coming back to Immanuel Kant, so do you accept that he can't justify suicide through the categorical imperative? It doesn't fit like theft or murder, but he's using a different system to justify why suicide is immoral.
No, of course it fits into the categorical imperative. It comes from the categorical imperative. We can see that when we universalize it, it could not possibly become a system of nature.
Why not? Not why everybody can kill themselves. What's the problem with that?
No, if it was universalized, we would see that it leads to a self-contradiction, right? It's not a practical limitation. Like everyone can just commit suicide right now. It's not a practical limitation. It's by pure reason we deduce that it could not possibly be a system of nature, a natural law, that it's morally permissible to kill yourself.
I don't see where the contradiction would be, or where the problem would be. Let's say, for example, everybody just takes a knife and just shoves it in their heart and kills themselves. Everyone's dead. One could argue that might be better for the planet. No human species, all the animals and wildlife can live independently. Why would that be immoral?
Well, what you're doing is you're saying this wouldn't be a problem under conceptualization of practical reason. But I'm not talking about practical reason. I'm talking about pure reason. And pure reason is when we universalize it, we picture a hypothetical in which everyone thought that suicide was morally permissible. And then we see if a contradiction would arise. The same with theft. Everyone can go and steal something. That's no problem. Everyone can just go and steal. And like you say yourself, in our last conversation, if everyone went around stealing, there's no practical limitation about stealing, but there would be no point. It would be pointless because everyone would end up having the same amount of money. In your example, in my example, I said, well, you would abolish property ownership. So that would be the conceptualization of theft would self-defeat because you've abolished property ownership, so then you can't have theft, and so it doesn't work. And then so that's not a practical limitation. That's a limitation of pure reason in saying that it could be morally permissible. So if we go back to suicide and we plug that into the categorical imperative and we universalize it, we can see that by the principle of self-love, that the principle which furthers the existence of life, that you should also desire to end life with this same principle, then we have a contradiction of the desire to further and end life. So to propagate and not propagate, or to you can cash this out as propagation, as furtherance, as probably furtherance. The original conceptualization is the nicest one. So you're both furthering and seeking to not further life simultaneously, which is a contradiction and could not possibly be permissible as a natural law of morality.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a bit of a peculiar argument, I think, because he's basically saying like people have a desire to live, and therefore, if you have a desire to die, that's a contradiction. But we know that suicide doesn't really work like that. People have they stop having the desire to live and self-love, and so I mean, I think it is a little
It's
bit.
not desire. It's not saying, everyone desires to live, therefore don't commit suicide because that's not desirable. It's not saying that, right? What it's saying is, if our principle of self-love results in us wanting to commit suicide because our life promises more dissatisfaction or evil than satisfaction, then because we love ourselves and we don't want to subject ourselves to the evil or the dissatisfaction of living, we will love ourselves and do ourselves a favor by ending our existence so we're not subjected to that. But in doing that, we have at one hand a principle of self-love to perform the suicide, and on the other hand, the principle of self-love is the furtherance of life itself. Because if the principle of self-love, if you loved yourself, was to kill yourself, it's contrary to the principle itself. So then we have a contradiction occur, not because it's desirable, not based on desire, based upon the principle of self-love.
Yeah, well, firstly, I would argue that many suicidal people would disagree with that and say that self-love principle doesn't exist within them. But secondly, not necessarily, because people may have beliefs in an afterlife, right? So we know that many suicide bombers commit the act because they believe they will be rewarded in an afterlife, right? So I don't think that argument would hold in all cases of suicide. But I don't want to get stuck on the issue of Kant. So I would like to move it on, if you're ready, to a couple of other issues.
Well, I feel like we haven't got them off the table yet. I feel like you've attempted to bring up counterexamples. The last one that I remember that you just did just now was the suicide bomber who's rewarded for his suicide. The problem there that you have is that we can see, using the categorical imperative, that the suicide bomber is mistaken. So if he believes that he will be rewarded in heaven for committing suicide, there is no other alternative than he is simply mistaken, because it's not possible, that it's not logically possible that it could be the case that it would be a moral thing. So maybe he thinks that he's committing an immoral act and he'll be rewarded nonetheless. Well, that's a separate issue. The proposition is about immorality, not about reward or pots of gold at the end of the tunnel greeted by a man on the cloud. That's something separate. So,
but you have to accept those presuppositions then, like you and Kant. Let's say you're both taking a naturalistic worldview that it's just you become dust, right, at the end of your life, and there is no afterlife, right? That's almost a presupposition that you have to accept, isn't it? But we don't know if that suicide bomber may be right. He may be rewarded in heaven, in which case, isn't it? He can morally justify his actions.
Or he can be rewarded all he likes, but he's still acting immorally, because it's not possible
according
that
to
he
you,
would act otherwise.
According to your moral system, your moral framework.
According to logic itself.
Well, I think we're going to get into the categorical imperative again here, aren't we? But I refute and dispute the categorical imperative. I don't think it is a good framework for morality. I don't think it is. I don't think you can ground morality in it, because I still think Kant is going from reason to morality, and I don't see how he makes that connection. Like Hume would say, he's going from the is to the ought, right? But I don't know if you want to go down that road and discuss all of that again, or whether you want me to just move the conversation on.
Well, the problem here is you've expressed a distaste for Kantian ethics, and that's fine. You can dislike it all you want, but what you haven't done is refuted it, or taken it, or refuted it in a way where we could possibly move on and consider that you could possibly win this debate by just disliking it. Because, like, for example, if we had 2 points on the table and you just said, I don't want to discuss this point because I don't like it, then yeah, you're not taking it off the table. You're just expressing a distaste for it. So what we can do though is we can postpone talking about this and just move to the utilitarian point, because the thing is, if you can defeat it from a utilitarian perspective, then we won't even need to speak about the deontological perspective, because you only require, for the goalpost of the debate, you only require to defeat one of them to win the debate. So if you can defeat either the deontology or the utilitarianism, then you win the debate. So for now, we'll just shelve the deontology, but it remains undefeated. Are you okay to move on to utilitarianism?
Okay, well, let me just stick with it then just for another moment or two, because I do have some other questions. So would you argue that anything that doesn't fit into the categorical imperative, anything that is self-defeating in the categorical imperative, is conclusively immoral?
Yes. However, it depends on what you plug in, right? So, because if you're going to plug things into it which are obviously incorrect, for example, can we universalize everyone wanting to go to the gym at 5 o'clock on a Tuesday? Well, probably not, because not everyone can fit in the gym at a 5 o'clock.
Well, no, let's go with the more simple one, like Hegel's argument. Let's say feeding the poor, right? So Hegel says if everyone fed the poor, there would be no poor left. It would self-defeat. Hence, it's an immoral action according to Kant's categorical imperative. Would you agree with that?
No. The problem with feeding the poor is it's something called an imperfect duty. We have perfect duties and imperfect duties, and this is a bit facepalm if that is actually attributed to Hegel. That's just a misunderstanding of imperfect duty. The second people attempt to feed the poor, there will be other people who give away their food and will become poor themselves. There'll be new poor people. We can never fully satisfy feeding the poor or feeding the hungry. It's something which, at the point that we think we've achieved it, there'll be new poor people to feed, or we might run out of food. There's always going to be, with imperfect duty, there's always going to be the ability to do more, and we're never going to be able to satisfy that ability. But we can satisfy the ability to not commit suicide. We can satisfy that duty, but we can't satisfy the duty to feed all of the poor people all of the time in all of the world. It doesn't work. That's why it's an imperfect duty.
Well, I'm not sure I agree with that, because it's a hypothetical, of course. It would never happen, just the same way that everybody stealing would never happen, or everybody murdering would never happen. But the point of the categorical imperative is that you're supposed to sort of plug in these behaviors and see what outcome arises, right? So the point is that you could theoretically, isn't it, self-defeat poverty. And that's Hegel's point.
No, you can't self-defeat poverty, because feeding the poor doesn't self-defeat poverty. The second you're fed, it doesn't mean you're not then impoverished. You can't. It is not possible to do that. That's why it's an imperfect duty. The same way that it's nice maybe to feed a squirrel, a hungry squirrel or bird or something in your garden. It might be nice, but you can't feed all of the birds in the world all of the time, and it's impossible it's impracticable. So therefore, it's an imperfect duty, because doing it some of the time, you can't be blamed for not doing it all of the time, and that's the case. And feeding the poor is an imperfect duty.
Okay, fine. Yeah, okay. Well, I mean, I'm still opposed to the categorical imperative. I think it is very limited, and I would appeal to the likes of Schopenhauer and Hume and amongst others, who Nietzsche, who also agree that it's a fallible system. But if I just I mean, we may just have to agree to disagree on that and move on to utilitarianism. But if we just talk about suicide briefly, because I think this is important. Historically, suicide was illegal. And in Britain, where we both are, it was decriminalized in 1961, so just short of 50 years ago, right? Now, even through the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church, especially under the influence of Aquinas, deemed suicide to be immoral. But more recently, over the last few decades, even they've changed their position. They accept that there is no immorality in suicide. And the reason for this is because over the last few decades, we have developed, along with the work of Freud, following on from the work of Freud and Jung, we have a better understanding of why people commit suicide. And the majority reason for why people commit suicide is mental illness, right? As I'm sure you're aware, depression being the main thing, right? And when a person is depressed, right, they do not act necessarily rationally, which is why under mental health law in most Western countries, you can detain a person against their will. It's called sectioning where we are. It's called committing in America, I believe. And you can treat them forcibly against their will. You can even perform procedures like ECT, electroconvulsive therapy, on them against their will, because they cannot make decisions rationally. Right? They don't have, it's called mental capacity. They lack the mental capacity to perform, to make an informed decision. So most psychiatrists will detain people, again using mental health law, who are suicidal, right? And they will treat them forcibly as well. Okay.
Right.
And they will conclude that the majority of people who do attempt suicide are not thinking rationally. They're reacting to a depression, to a illness, and a treatable illness, right? So they cannot be held accountable for those actions, which is similar even in criminal law, right? If somebody is criminally insane, you don't say they acted immorally because they don't have mental capacity to understand their actions and the consequences of their action. Acting under duress, we could say. So in that sense, do you think everybody who kills themselves because they're severely mentally unwell is immoral?
No,
Immoral.
and I'll explain why. But there's a couple of things on the table, so I just want to take them off in order that you said them, if my memory serves me correctly. Firstly, you said that not everyone agrees with Kant, and Schopenhauer and Nietzsche were examples given. And the thing is, the categorical imperative only gets you to some moral facts. It doesn't get you to all moral facts. And the problem there is most people are looking for all moral facts. They're looking for guidance. They're looking to know objectively what is the case all of the time. And the thing is, with the Kantian system, we can objectively arrive at some things, but then there's the rest of it is descriptivism, because then we're saying, would we want to live in this world, etc. So some people aren't satisfied with that. So I can grant all day long the deontology, that a Kantian system might not get us to a perfectly good way to live if you're looking for something more rigid or some other system. But what it can get us to is that some moral facts exist, and suicide is one of those moral facts that is immoral. You mentioned, so that was Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. Maybe it covers that. I would just disagree with Schopenhauer, as much as I love him on everything else, when he says that the categorical imperative doesn't work for some moral propositions. And the you said that Aquinas, you mentioned Aquinas and said that the position was changed. Well, Aquinas obviously didn't change his position, but I'm guessing you're appealing to the Catholicism as a movement, let's say. Or they can change their mind all they want. I'm going to take Aquinas' word over some child molester or whatever. That was a bit of a low blow, but whatever.
Yeah, but the point I was making is that this change coincides with our better understanding of mental illness.
Yeah, and then the final point you raised, which I was just going to acknowledge after talking about the philosophers, was that nowadays we see there's people, we've got an understanding that suicide might be as of the result of mental illness. Now, as we both agree upon, suicide is an intentional action to end your own life, right? And we would say that this would have to be performed given the ability to act rationally, or given the ability where, like Kant says, for example, ought implies can. And if we're going to say ought implies can, but these people can't, then they can't ought. right? Then there isn't any ought that exists because they can't, right? So if we say ought implies can, then that defeats that point. I'm gonna have to duck out for a couple of minutes, maybe just 60 seconds,
Yeah,
and
that's fine.
we'll continue the debate with utilitarianism next.
Yeah.
So I've been unmuted now. Cool. So I'm back.
Okay, no problem. Yep. Yeah. So just to respond to those points you made, yeah, I actually agree with you there. Then, yeah, because if you can't form the intent, yeah, we would deem that the person does have to have a certain mental capacity to form intent, right? But that's not to say the person still can't be severely mentally unwell. You would agree with that, right? So you can have depression, severe depression, want to kill yourself, be able to rationalize and make that decision, yet you would argue it's still an immoral act because they're sort of escaping from their mental suffering.
No, it's not immoral if they can't act rationally. But the
No, they
problem,
can act rationally. I'm conceding that they can act rationally, but they have severe crippling depression.
right? So in that case, that you just have, well, not just have depression. Like I don't want to belittle the condition or something like this, but yeah, if you're fully rational but have depression, then yes, it is immoral for you. That's why I'm arguing that Kurt Cobain was immoral by committing suicide. But someone who just like literally like is in a padded cell, obviously like wouldn't fall into that category, right?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and you included obviously euthanasia in this would be included in that category as well.
Euthanasia depends, but yeah, basically, if we could make some case that if you're going to die in like 5 days and there's no, I don't know. It's a slippery slope with that one because it would have to be such a small time span that, and you wouldn't be able to, like, if you could not experience any meaningful experiences at all, you would already be in the position that you were not able to act rationally anyway. In that case, so no, I don't think euthanasia.
Well, hold on a moment. Yeah, hold on a moment. Let's take an example of somebody who has a severe neurological condition. So let's say their life expectancy isn't drastically reduced. They may live for another 30 years or so, but they're in excruciating pain. They're very limited in what they can do, and they have expressed a wish to die for years. You would say it's immoral for them to take their own life, commit suicide, or even go through euthanasia, assisted suicide.
Yes.
Okay, that's fine. I mean, and you see, I think that doesn't fit with most people. Most people would say that isn't an immoral act. Well, actually, yeah, actually, that might not be true. There are pro-lifers who would argue it's the same as you have just done, but
yeah, they're just all mistaken.
Yeah. Okay. But yeah. So coming back to the mental illness point, as I said, most suicide is caused by mental illness, whether it's depression or something else. And yeah, so you would say that the person who kills themselves, even while severely depressed, as long as they as long as they have some rational faculty, as long as they can rationalize the decision, they would be immoral as well.
Yeah, if they can act rationally with moral agency, then they're committing an immoral act if they commit suicide.
Okay, and you're appealing to Kant's moral framework to deduce to conclude that, right?
Right, and actually, when I say if they're acting rationally, no, it doesn't matter if they're acting rationally. If they have moral agency, is what is more accurate to say.
Okay. Yep. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So I think we have a fundamental just disagreement on deontology there. Like for example, if I appeal to like theistic morality, right, and let's just say Christian morality for the sake of argument. So thou shalt not murder. Traditionally, I think the Catholic Church based suicide on that commandment as well, because they saw suicide as a form of self-murder. But that view changed more recently, and suicide isn't considered a form of self-murder now. And there's nothing in Christian morality which clearly says that suicide is immoral. So I think if you're appealing to a different moral framework like that, then it's not deontology to say suicide is murder. Would you agree there?
Well, no. Well, a divine command theory can say whatever it wants. It can say that it's immoral not to jump to the sky, but then they're just mistaken. Everything that a divine commandment theorist would say that is in contradiction with logic, they're just mistaken about.
Yeah, I mean, this is our fundamental disagreement, isn't it? It was coming back to our fundamental disagreement on deontology. So I say deontology is an objective moral code that exists because of a moral authority. If it exists, I'm not claiming it does, but I'm saying that's the only way you can have deontology, whereas you're basing it in reason. Yeah, you're basing it in logic, aren't you?
Yeah, if something's logically impossible, it cannot be the case. By definition.
Yeah, so if something is illogically impossible, you're saying it's immoral. So, for example, a married bachelor is immoral according to you.
No, I'm saying that's a logical impossibility. But we can conclude that if something's logically impossible to be moral, then it can't possibly be morally permissible.
Yeah, I see. I think that's the jump you're making, isn't it? You and Kant both make, because David Hume would disagree, and he would say you're still going from reason to morality there. You're still going from the is to the ought, and that's something he says you can't do.
Yeah, well, Kant was a reply to David Hume, right? That was who Kant was replying to.
Yeah. So my position is essentially that I think you can reason the laws of logic and you can reason the laws of maths, but I don't believe that you can reason the laws of morality. I don't see why you can go from making making statements about what is logically feasible and not, to saying what is right and what is wrong, what you ought do and what you ought not do. And I think that's our fundamental disagreement on deontology. If you take my view, then you would have to conclude suicide is not immoral. But if you take your view, I suppose you can argue that suicide is immoral. But even then, I don't think personally you've made the case like you would have with murder and theft and rape.
Well, I've demonstrated multiple times now how it introduces a self-contradiction. And what you're arguing at this point is that you don't believe that self-contradictory moral propositions by entailment constitute immorality. And I'm saying that if we're talking about morality, then we couldn't possibly, if we're talking about morality in the context of something that could possibly be a natural law, then we couldn't possibly have a self-contradictory natural law. So you can go and say, oh, well, I think you can have self-contradictory natural laws as much as you like, but you're just wrong.
Yeah, I agree. You can't have contradictory natural laws, right? But the point is, morality is not a natural law. It's an ought statement, isn't it? It's what you ought do, what is good, what is bad.
Right, yeah, no, but I'm arguing that if there's any fact of the matter, then it acts as if it would be, or as a natural law, right? Because I don't know what it would mean to say that something was immoral if it didn't correspond to anything that can be conceptualized as a natural law of morality, because then it's just like what you're appealing to at that point. If
Well,
you're
it's
appealing to God, well, then God is the natural moral law,
yeah,
but then God
well,
can't be
exactly.
self-contradictory.
Yeah, well, exactly. I mean, and that's a view that many moral philosophers take, that the only way you can have objective morality is with a moral authority, right? Otherwise, they say it's moral subjectivism. I think that's probably the majority view of naturalists, right?
Well,
I
if we're going to
suppose.
say that there's this law of morality, whether it's moral or not, and there's some law dictating this, well, then the law can't be self-contradictory, because then that wouldn't be a law by definition.
Well, yes, I can agree to. Well, yeah, I mean, that I would agree. I would agree with that.
Right. So then let's move on to utilitarianism, because you failed to defeat deontology in that
Well,
case.
before we move on, I still think, look, I can accept, okay, for the sake of argument, I will accept your moral framework says that murder is wrong, theft is wrong. I believe you've argued for rape. You can put into that categorical imperative as well. Lying is wrong. I can accept that as well. But I still don't see how you're getting suicide is wrong from this. And maybe we may just have to agree to disagree and move on. But if you're just going to say it's based on this self-love principle, and if you kill yourself, you can't self-love yourself, and it just seems a little bit wishy-washy. And I don't think Kant's making a solid argument from reason for it.
Well, I think he is, and I've told you it multiple times now. I can read it again if you want, but we can, like, I don't agree to disagree. What I can do is I can just say, okay, we'll leave that undefeated and move on, because you have the opportunity to defeat. The debate isn't over. You have the opportunity to defeat me on the utilitarian point as well, right?
So let's move on to the utilitarian point then. Do you want to begin?
Yeah, well, we can just see on utilitarian calculus that murder or killing is pretty much like one of the worst things that you can possibly do in terms of utility, negative utility. And then we have to add up all of the fans who, some of which also committed suicide because as a result of Kurt Cobain committing suicide because of their grievance, because they were such fans, right? And all of the people as a result who just felt deprived and grieved as a result of his very public death. He was one of the most famous at that point in time. He was probably the most famous person in the world. And the suicide, with the suicide, that probably accelerated him to be at that point in time, the most famous person in the world over all of the news channels. And people committed suicide themselves as a result. And adding up all the utility, there's not very much positive utility that came out of that. Like his child now hasn't got a father. His wife Courtney Love now doesn't have a husband. His family, his parents, all of these losses and grievances. There's no positive utility that came out of, unless you want to argue that the utility of him ending his life because he felt so much pain outweighed all of the suffering that came as a result. Then I'd say that is quite clearly immoral.
Okay, well, I will try to argue for that, but just before I do, so we are specifically referencing Kurt Cobain here. Would you argue that suicide of an average person, let's say just an average person, we don't know their specific situation, but they're not famous, would that be in your mind moral from a utilitarian perspective?
Yeah, so from a utilitarian perspective, if some person who no one liked committed suicide in order to save 1 trillion people or something, then there's a case that we can point to in utilitarianism to say that within the framework of this mistaken, stupid system, which I think is a joke, yes, it would be moral.
Okay, no. I mean, let's say an average person. Let's say I know there's no such thing as an average person, but let's just say somebody who's got a wife and 2 children. He's a 40-year-old man, an average size family, extended family, an average size or average group of friends, amount of friends, but he's not famous. In that situation, what would you say, or would you want to know more about the specifics?
Yeah, well, that's the one of the limitations with utilitarianism. You can never really know until you've like if there's well, a classic example given by Tom Reagan of I think there was 4 or 5 boys who like raped this mentally disabled girl who was like, I don't know, 11 or something, and in afterwards, as a utilitarian, you have to ask, okay, so the negative utility of the girl, of the parents of the girl, of the people involved, how everyone was upset from this, and how it was a horrible, traumatic, tragic experience. But then you have to go, oh, wait a minute, hold on. What about the pleasure that the boys got out of it? Think of the boys. The boys got some pleasure out of it. Let's account for that. Let's make it less bad, slightly less bad overall, because the boys got some pleasure out of it, right? So the way that I see it, the way that Tom Reagan sees it, and the way that most sane people see it is, if the boys got pleasure out of it, that makes it even worse in some case, right? But in the bizarre, mistaken reality of bizarre, mistaken, supposed reality of the utilitarian's mind, it's actually considered less bad, right? So in this sense, we have to involve everyone. We have to say, what about the murderer? What about the rapist? Did they get any pleasure out of it? What about this person over there? And we can never really be sure under utilitarianism. But so that's why we have to point to extreme cases that are more obvious.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm happy to stick with. I agree with you. I think it's almost impossible. This utilitarian calculus is just, it's almost impossible, isn't it? You could never really work it out unless, well, even if you have all the details, it's extremely difficult to work it out. But let's stick with Kurt Cobain, right? So we know that the grief reaction, right, bereavement and the grieving reaction typically lasts for 6 months. That's when you lose a close family member, right? A spouse even, or even a parent or even a child. The typical adjustment reaction is about 6 months. Then people sort of tend to get back to their baseline, right? So this period of suffering is about 6 months.
I can grant that.
Sorry?
I can grant that, although I have no idea, but I'll grant that.
Yeah, it is. From psychological studies suggests that, right? The vast majority of people who are fans of Kurt Cobain are probably not going to have 6 months of suffering, because it's 6 months is generally considered is the amount of time it takes for close family members and spouses and children to recover. So we're talking, I think the average Nirvana fan, I mean, I was a Nirvana fan and you were as well, as you said, and I don't think we grieved for 6 months at the time. There may have been a little bit of upset, but I wouldn't go anything more than that. And Kurt Cobain was 27, right? And let's presume he suffered immensely and tremendously from an underlying mental illness and drug addictions. And I think you mentioned earlier, before we started the debate, he had some severe stomach ailments. And, the average life of a person at his time was probably 80. So he probably had another 50 years of suffering to go through. I think you could make a utilitarian argument to say that it was positive utility for him to end his life.
Right, but what about the 50 years of positive utility left for all of the children or teenagers who committed suicide as a result of him committing suicide?
Well, we don't. That's something which is very difficult to prove. I mean, we don't know how many people kill themselves because of him killing himself, do
but
we?
it's equally difficult to prove with Kurt himself, because he has stomach issues, right? And that could have been stomach cancer, which would have killed him in 2 weeks' time. He had already had severe pain from it, so we wouldn't know.
Well, yeah, I mean, we've got to work on some averages here. The law of averages, isn't it? And presume that it wasn't a terminal illness, and that he would have lived an average life, right? And got to the age of, close to 80.
Yeah, well, that's a huge assumption there.
Well, but that's what you can do with utilitarianism, isn't it? You have to make these assumptions, otherwise you can't make any utilitarian calculus.
Well, that's why it's one of the reasons why it's dumb. But
I agree with you. I think I do agree. I think it's a silly system, but it's part of what we're debating, isn't it? So yeah. I'm just arguing that work on average principles. I think you could argue there was positive utility. Because somebody who is severely mentally distressed, right, is not committing suicide lightly. They're doing it to alleviate intense suffering, and that suffering is absolutely, it's the argument for euthanasia as well, isn't it? That suffering is outweighs any sort of pleasure that they get, and even outweighs the few weeks or months of grief and suffering that their family members and close friends and relatives will experience. That's why people do go through euthanasia.
Well, I think that in the case of Kurt Cobain, because it's a fact that other teenagers, well, not other teenagers because he wasn't a teenager, but other people of teenage and adulthood, I think I'll need to, like, I'm on my phone, so it's difficult to, if I've got push to talk on, and I'm on my phone, so I can't really go Ari and without like stopping talking to you. But like, you can do it your side if you want. You can just Google people did commit suicide as a result of Kurt Cobain committing suicide, because they like, found it. He was like their hero, or he was the reason why they wanted to live in a way. And then he killed himself, and they were like, oh, well, my role model, my hero killed himself, then I'll do so as well. They were thinking. So if we look at it from that point of negative utility, then the negative utility of Kurt is multiplied out tremendously by all of the people who committed suicide, and then that's not even including the people who mourned for him and grieved by the loss and the deprivation of potential music that he could have brought joy with the music.
Okay, well, I would be very surprised if there were lots of, as you say, of people who committed suicide just purely based on the suicide of Kurt Cobain. There may have been some, I'll grant you that. But even if there were some, they would have been experiencing severe mental distress as well from that suicide, right? So we don't know. So there, and people who commit suicide, like let's say people did commit suicide following the suicide of Kurt Cobain, they're going to have most likely going to have underlying mental health problems themselves, right? And they're going to be predisposed towards suicide. I don't think anybody. I mean, like I said, we were both fans of Kurt Cobain. I don't think suicide. Well, I'm presuming suicide didn't cross your mind when he did it. So I think the vast majority of people, they may feel a bit of upset for some time, but are not going to commit suicide. The ones who do commit suicide are those that would probably commit suicide anyway for other reasons. They're just waiting for that trigger. And it so happens that the trigger was Kurt Cobain in this situation. But if it wasn't Kurt Cobain, it would have been something later down the line, most probably.
Yeah, you can argue that. But in a utilitarian worldview, you're going to have to say, well, if that was the cause, then that was the cause. Like, that's what pushed the other people over the edge, right? So that was the determining factor. Maybe someone else would have pulled the trigger metaphorically at some other date, but it in this case was the result of Kurt Cobain. And even if you're gonna discount the suicides, we've still got we've got half the world mourning, right? How not only did he kill himself, which is like negative 1 million utility points, but half the world is now mourning. So we've got 1 million people with 1 utility point minus each, or something like this. So we've got minus 2 million utility points. And you're saying that him counteracting, like outbalancing some stomach pain that he had, which he was already like taking pain relief in the form of heroin for. So if you're on heroin, I can probably you could probably make a case that you'd be not in so much pain if you're on heroin. And I would argue, in a utilitarian sense, it's actually a positive thing. In terms of utility, to be on heroin in certain. Well, that's another reason why utilitarianism is stupid. But yeah, there we go.
Okay, well, Footsoldier, on that point, let's say everybody, I mean, I'm sure you'll grant me this, isn't it? Everybody is destined to die. Everybody will die. So even if Kurt Cobain didn't commit suicide, he would die at some point, right? And people are going to grieve when he dies, right? So whether he dies at the age of 27 or 57, right, people are going to grieve. That negative utility is always going to be there.
I see where you're going. However, the problem with that is when someone dies at age 90, And like Bertrand Russell dies at age 98 or something, or however old he was, and everyone's like, "Oh, did you hear Bertrand Russell died?" And everyone's like, "Oh yeah, well, he had a good life. He got to a really old age. Like he did really well. He had a great innings." Versus 27-year-old Kurt Cobain blows his head off with a shotgun, and there was like at the time, people sort of doing copycat suicides. There was people so upset by it, like transformed their entire life for the worst, because all of their identity was wrapped up in Nirvana, because it was such a huge movement at the time. And when the band disbanded after the death, and okay, the Foo Fighters were born out of the ashes a couple of years later, but that the whole identity, whether you transitioned to become a Foo Fighters fan later or whether you got into some other band, is sort of beside the point, because your whole identity, if that was your identity at the time, your whole identity being wrapped up in Nirvana, and then your hero just blows his head off, then that's your entire identity, right? The entire culture that you belong to. Grunge basically just like
well,
yeah.
For a vast minority of people, right? Because I grant that he had a lot of fans, but I mean, I wouldn't grant that the majority of people would have been so distressed that they would have contemplated suicide or attempted suicide, right?
I
Most
think a
people
large amount of people, we're talking, if not millions, hundreds of thousands of people were like extremely affected because of it.
Yeah, but not committing suicide, right? Not attempting suicide.
Well, some number of people did do copycat suicides. There's even studies on this, like saying that there's a study like from Australia saying that they concluded it did not significantly impact suicide rates that much in Australia, but that is not ruling out the fact that there were actually copycat suicides, like multiple, many, in fact. And just in Australia, that was like in fact across the world, especially in America, there was actually a sizable amount of copycat suicides after Kurt Cobain killed himself.
Yeah, I accept and acknowledge the copycat phenomenon, because that exists even on television, right? In dramas, when certain things happen in popular soaps or dramas, there is a copycat phenomenon, but it is a vast minority of people. That's the point I'm making, and I don't know whether you can blame. I don't know whether you can blame it, like even a Quentin Tarantino film, right? They say that some people have tried to correlate an increase in violence and crime with Quentin Tarantino films, right? But I don't know if you could argue that his films.
I think actually, although I'm a huge Quentin Tarantino fan and I absolutely love pretty much all of his movies, there is actually genuinely a case to be made that it results in people doing weird shit, or at least like putting people in different, like altering people's states of minds and stuff like this. And there is actually research into this, and it's contentious, but it's contentious for a reason, because there's actually some data to suggest that it might be the case, despite the fact that most people like myself who enjoy Quentin Tarantino films don't want it to be the case.
But would you accept that it's nigh impossible to work out whether his films result in negative utility or positive utility? Because a lot of people like yourself will gain pleasure from watching them. So would you agree with me that the utilitarian calculus is impossible to work out in such a situation?
I would say that the utilitarian calculus is dumb, and that's the reason why I'm not utilitarian, and it's probably very difficult to work out in that case. But if we're going to talk about utilitarianism, we can see that in the case of Kurt Cobain is very clear cut from all of the copycat suicides and all of the mourning and all of the horrible shit that came as a result. And the only thing that you can point to which would possibly outbalance all of this negative utility would be, oh, he doesn't have stomach pains and depression anymore, who is on heroin anyway. So him continuing his life on heroin, living in a drugged out bubble, would be preferable under utilitarianism, like every day of the week.
Well, you're making a presupposition there about his mental state. You don't know what his mental state, what he was going through. He may have been suffering with intractable, severe persevering, crippling depression, right, which made him, you know, extremely miserable all of the time, the highest level of suffering you could imagine, right? So imagine if you were sort of being tortured every day, right? You're not going to say, I'm going to continue going through this torture because of the greater good, you know, because of what my fans will suffer if I don't. So
it doesn't appear to be the case from testimony and the suicide note. So the suicide note mentions the fact that he was dissatisfied with his stage presence and the enjoyment that he got whilst performing, and that he thought that maybe he was a bad neurotic person or something like this. But he didn't say that he was in physical pain, and his friends and people at the time can attest to him having stomach pain, but that's the reason why he started doing heroin. And at the time of his death, he was on a fair amount of heroin anyway. And heroin, for anyone who doesn't know the effects, is also a type of painkiller, similar in nature to morphine, but dirtier street drug and highly addictive. And obviously, morphine you get in hospital. So there's many. You could say, okay, well, it's immoral because he could have just gone to the hospital, and rather getting all of this negative utility, to simply committed himself to the hospital and got some morphine and like just dealt with it in the normal course that we have systems available to help people. But he didn't. He decided to take morality or take everything into his own hands and blow his head off with a shotgun. And it just doesn't seem to be something which could be considered moral under utilitarianism at all.
Yeah, but we know with substance abuse, many of these drug users have comorbid mental illnesses, severe mental illnesses. And the thing with severe mental illnesses like depression is that you become helpless and hopeless and you don't feel like there's any way out, right? So that's one of the reasons they often don't seek help, and instead they self-isolate and they consider and contemplate suicide, and often will attempt suicide, as he did. So I don't think you can simply brush it off and say, oh, it was just a stomach ache and he was taking heroin and, you know, he wasn't suffering intolerably, because we don't know that. Because the issue is with suicide, you can't do a post-mortem of their mental state, can you? You can do a post-mortem to determine their physical health, but you can't do a post-mortem to determine their mental health. And you can speak to family members and friends and they can give you an idea, but they may not even know, because many people suffering with mental illness don't share their mental illness with loved ones or friends. It's kept to themselves. So I think it's reasonable to presume, though, that anybody who does commit suicide is suffering severe mental illness. I mean, that's it.
I'm not saying that Kurt Cobain just had a little stomachache and he should have just taken an aspirin and got on with it. Like I'm not saying that. It's obviously way more severe than that. He had severe stomach aches or severe stomach pain, and he was depressed, and he decided to take his life. But the reasons stated were not because I can't cope with the pain. The reasons stated were, I feel like I'm inauthentic, right? He was saying that he felt like he was inauthentic as a public image or something. There was a problem with identity and authenticity, and these types of questions. It wasn't, I'm in so much pain I can't take this, I'm going to end my life. It wasn't that at all. Although that case could exist, and we could argue about that separately. But that's a tangent to this conversation, because we're talking about Kurt Cobain. Kurt Cobain didn't appear to be in unmanageable agony, and he was actually on painkillers at the time, and so he probably wasn't in all that much physical pain. It was probably just mental. I say just, I don't want to belittle it, but it was mainly mental pain.
And I grant that. I'll grant that. I don't think it was. Well, I'm not making the case for physical pain here or euthanasia. I'm making the case for the mental pain.
Right, and in that case, we can see. Well, would you say that the cessation of any mental pain that he has somehow outweighs all of the copycat suicides, all of the grievances, and everything that happened as a result, and everyone who mourned, the millions and millions of people who mourned his death after? Was that a justification in a utilitarian perspective?
I think you can make the case, because I think it's nigh impossible to calculate that degree of suffering, right? But I would argue that it's not immense. Like when a celebrity dies, I don't think I think the vast majority of people will get over it relatively quickly. It's the close friends and family that will probably suffer the most, right? And those
So
people.
well, what I can do though, if you think that the mental pain is that huge, it's got so many negative utility points, then I could just say, well, the fans who copycat suicide did copycat suicides, they experienced comparably large mental pain, which led them to commit suicide, and the parents of the children must have experienced huge amounts of mental pain as well, which meant if that initial mental pain of Kurt Cobain was so bad that it justifies all horrible things, then all of the mental pain that came as a result would have been many magnitudes worse.
Which is why I justified it by saying, didn't I, that people who commit suicide because a celebrity has committed suicide not, I can't make this claim outright, but I will say probably have an underlying degree of mental illness themselves, so they're already suffering. That's why I made that point, and they probably would commit suicide or attempt suicide or have severe mental health problems at some point down the line, right? Because it's just a form of idolism. They'll just replace Kurt Cobain with somebody else. And
so what you're positing is that the mental pain was pre-existent to the suicide of
yes,
Kurt. And okay, but that
was triggered by that.
Yeah, but that's just sort of begging the question of the that's just an assertion, right? But what would be more likely, I think, would be to say that the grievance of what happened induced or at least increased mental suffering of many people to the point where they did commit suicide. So by whatever margin that increased the mental suffering of the people who committed suicide and their parents and their family members and everyone like that would have to be less than all of the pre-existing mental suffering, which I don't know if you are in a position to make that claim. It seems like that's a controversial claim.
Yeah, but like I said, it's if we work on the principle which you granted, that close friends and family will suffer for 6 months, right? Up to 6 months of mental anguish. As we said, Kurt Cobain would have to suffer the rest of his life with this severe, enduring, and mental illness, right? It's difficult.
Can I just interrupt there? The parents of the children or teenagers or adults who committed suicide as a result have to endure the rest of their lives knowing that they've lost their child and that all of the tragedy surrounding all of the situation, right? So they have to endure. So even if you're saying it's only 6 months, well, then that's multiplied out by all of the people affected, which is many, many people. So that
we don't know how many, do we? We don't know how many. That's the issue.
That's because there's no solid statistics, but we can say that it's more than the amount necessary to negate any balancing of utility from Kurt Cobain's remainder of life.
But the question is as well, that will come down. This will boil down to is: does an individual have moral responsibility for the unforeseen effects of his action? Now, I'll just put a quote in here of the Oscar Wilde quote. Right, he said he suffered, I think, with physical pain and mental anguish, mental pain, and he said the only antidote to mental suffering is physical pain. Right. So what he meant by that is that the mental pain and mental suffering is far greater than any physical pain and any suffering. Right. From a psychological perspective, that's like the greatest negative utility an individual can have.
Well, I actually think that you've got a point. The quote is good because sometimes the antidote to mental pain can be physical pain, but I don't think that's saying that it's greater than mental pain. I think it's a different sort which can distract from the mental pain and actually works sometimes. But
correct. Which is why people may self-harm and things like that. But that's why. But it does imply that, because that's what he's saying, isn't it? It's the antidote, isn't it? He's saying it's better to choose the physical pain over the mental pain.
He's not making a claim about which is worse, but
not necessarily.
We're going to have to wrap up the debate now.
So I think It looks like we just fundamentally disagree on both the utilitarian argument and the deontological one, right?
We do disagree. However, you failed to establish that we failed to defeat either position. So either you concede right now, or we're going to have to go to a vote. But in terms of the debate goalposts were that you were arguing against it, and you haven't successfully defeated either.
Well, you say that, but I think I've just presented a case against the utilitarian argument for Kurt Cobain's death with suicide, which does defeat it.
But it's based upon a shaky assertion, which I've just demonstrated is probably misguided.
Probably, that being the point. You're the one making the positive claim, right? So you have to demonstrate that it is negative utility, that his suicide was negative utility, and I don't think you've made the case to demonstrate.
No, I think everyone listening has seen that the case has been made that anyone who doubts this, it's a very fringe position. You can doubt it, and you are doubting it because you've got the task right now of doubting it to argue against it in the debate. But everyone listening can quite clearly see that if Kurt Cobain committed suicide, he has all the negative utility of taking his own life. All of the people who copycatted him committed suicide. It has all the negative utility of the suicides. All of the parents of the people who committed suicide have the negative utility of that. Kurt Cobain has the negative utility of Courtney Love and his child and all of his other family members, of Dave Grohl, of Chris Novoselic, and all of the other people in the music industry who are deeply grieving because of that. There's so much grievance that came as a result of it that it's incomprehensible how much suffering the millions and millions of around the world. I think I'm just going to have to rest my case there, man.
Well, before you do, let me just ask one final question. Then, are you do you think that all immoral acts should be illegal?
No.
Can you give me an example of an immoral act other than suicide that is not illegal?
Lying.
Right. So you take the view that lying is always immoral, right? You like Kantian categorical imperative. It's always immoral to lie, right?
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah. Well, what do you mean? Pretty much, it's either yes or no. Absolutely wrong. Like even if the Nazi police are at the door and you're hiding a Jewish family, it's always immoral, right?
Yeah, it's immoral.
Okay, fine. Okay, because otherwise, you would be advocating for the recriminalization of suicide, but you're not.
No, that's not the debate proposition or my position anyway.
Fine. Okay. So do you want to add a closing statement?
Do you want to go first?
Yeah. So I'll just say, yeah, obviously myself and Footsoldier just have a fundamental disagreement on what deontology is. He appeals to Kant and the Kantian categorical imperative, but even if I concede that is a viable grounding, a viable code of ethics, I don't think he can make the case for suicide with it. He can make the case for theft, murder, rape, or lying, but I think suicide is a bit more tricky. The other thing is as well, presumably Footsoldier would not say it is immoral to die of cancer, but for some reason he says it is immoral to get crippling depression and take your life. And I don't think he's made a good reason to make that distinction. And obviously he's already conceded that he would consider euthanasia immoral under his worldview. Yeah, I think my position is that we disagree fundamentally on the deontology position, but also the utilitarian position. I don't think he's made the case to show that Kurt Cobain's suicide has definitively results in negative utility. We don't know what Kurt Cobain's mental state was at the time of the act, but we can presume that he was suffering intolerably from severe mental illness, and that's obviously the reason why he did take his life. And I don't think people generally who commit suicide are doing an immoral act from a utilitarian perspective, because they're clearly doing it because they're suffering intolerably and can take it as the only way out. And yeah, I think I'll end there. So I'll let you give your closing statement.
Okay, nice one. Yeah, so good debate. I think my closing statements would be there was two the debate proposition was a conjunction of two things, that it was immoral in terms of deontology and immoral in terms of utilitarianism. The first half of the debate, we discussed the deontology, and I established how it is morally wrong in a Kantian ethical system, how it's logically impossible that it would be the case that it would be morally permissible to kill yourself. I established that, and Jiva wasn't able to defeat that position, so we moved on to utilitarianism. So my positive case stands there. In utilitarianism, we didn't come to a complete agreement, because I don't think that in a utilitarian worldview, it's always going to be fuzzy. As we discussed, there's going to be a calculus that needs to be required, and if you rape someone in a utilitarian world, you need to take into account the pleasure that the rapist got, and which is just outrageous and something I think is awful. But because of this, it makes the calculus very difficult. But I think in the case of Kurt Cobain, when we look at the negative utility caused, we have to take into account the copycat suicides, which is going to be huge amounts of negative utility, because not only of the suicides themselves, which are just incredibly large amounts of huge negative utilitarian utility, but also because of the mourning of the parents of the people who committed suicide, and the family members of the people who committed suicide, and all the friends of the people who committed suicide, but also all of the friends and family and band members of Kurt Cobain, his wife, his child who will grow up without father, all of the people who have been deprived of another Nirvana record, all of the people who looked up to Kurt Cobain as a hero, to Nirvana as their identity, people wearing the Nirvana branded t-shirts, and that was like their identity in their youth, completely shattered. And just the entire negative, like, just disappointment and amazement at how, wow, it was 27, he blew his head off with the shotgun like that. Every part of that is negative, apart from, you could say, oh well, he didn't have a stomach ache anymore, he didn't have stomach pain anymore, and he didn't have like mental pain anymore. Well, he, in his suicide note, as we discussed, it didn't even mention that he was in any type of chronic or mental pain. It was saying about his feeling of inauthenticity when performing, and his feeling of maybe not being a good father tacitly in there, or something like this. And I think all of these things would be better corrected just by going to a hospital and maybe getting treatment for his pain. Morphine, being on heroin or morphine is preferable to being the highest profile person in the world and blowing your head off with a shotgun and creating all of the shitstorm that arose. So in a utilitarian calculus, 100%, unless you're taking some super fringe view, that's going to be immoral. In a deontological perspective, I've given an account why suicide is always immoral, and it remains undefeated in this debate. So I guess what we're just going to have to vote on now, because it's going to go to a vote because there was no concession. You're going to have to vote on who you thought had the better performance in the debate, I guess, but also whether you think it's a compelling case of all the copycat suicides and all of the negativity that came as a result, or whether you think that him ending his life, balancing out his stomach pain and his depression, was actually worth all of that negative suffering. And my case is that it wasn't. So Stone, if you're there, we can close it off.